let's slowly get started. It's our pleasure today to welcome Dan Ershov from Toulouse, who'll talk to us about effect of influencer advertising, disclosure regulations. Couple of quick logistics, a reminder, please ask the questions through the Q&A, and then we'll go for about 1 hour. And if you'd like, stick around for a discussion afterwards. We have several panelists with us today, so thank you all for joining. For panelists, please feel free to ask questions during the talk right away. All right, Dan, welcome, and the floor is yours.
Great. Thanks a lot, everyone, for inviting me to the seminar. I'm very excited to give this talk to this crowd. So this is a paper about advertising disclosure regulations titled "With Evidence from Instagram," and it's joint work with Matt Mitchell from the University of Toronto. So just to motivate things a little bit, basically this paper is about influencer regulations on social media, is about advertising regulations on social media, but really what we're going to think about is more generally, like the big picture question that we're after is really how to regulate advice on the internet. And if you think about it in a broader sense, consumers oftentimes rely on lots of advice from many intermediaries online because there's just so many choices of things to choose from. And one of the most obvious examples is when you ask Google kind of to show you things. And some of the things that Google chooses to show you are organic results. Some of the things that Google chooses to show you are paid ads that it discloses as ads. And some of the things that Google chooses to show you are also links that actually benefit Google without being directly disclosed. So for example, YouTube videos. And so the question is exactly, what is the mix that these people or entities that provide advice are generating between the different types of content, the different types of advice that they're producing, the sponsored advice that they're paid for, the advice that they're not disclosing, the advice that they're disclosing. And the issue is particularly relevant because, if you think about intermediaries on the internet, they're most of the time, they're not compensated directly for their advice or for the content that they're producing. So for example, I don't pay Kim Kardashian to tell me what, makeup to buy, and I don't pay Google directly to tell me, how to find a particular academic article. And so because these intermediaries are not directly compensated, there's a lot of concern about this, the content or quality of different advice and how it's impacted by this compensation mechanism. And again, as I said, you might be worried that Google is going to steer search results to its own properties that make it more money, or that advice by influencers on social media would be affected by the payments that they're getting from sponsors. So they're going to give suboptimal advice based on the money that they're getting. And basically, whether and how to regulate this sort of advice is a really big policy concern right now in many different jurisdictions. And this is especially a concern on social media platforms because of this idea that there's some of this advice or paid advice is hidden or deceptive in some way and that is not really visible to consumers. And this is also true on Google. We don't necessarily exactly know how Google makes money from all the pages that it shows. And so in response is basically these disclosure regulations that are appearing in many countries that require, putting some sort of language in front of paid or sponsored content, like putting a hashtag ad. And so this paper is really going to tackle the question of what are the effects of these advertising disclosure regulations on the content and the engagement in user-generated social media platforms. So again, our specific focus and our data is going to come from Instagram, but our bigger picture policy is going to apply to kind of a wider array of places. And I just wanted to say, again, I'll have a bit more on the literature in a few slides, but basically this is a completely open empirical question because there's essentially like two kinds of perspectives here from the theoretical side. On the one hand side, there's a perspective of regulatory agencies, which basically comes from this like buyer-seller theory. And they basically say that more information is always better. And basically, once consumers or followers on social media know exactly what's sponsored and what's not sponsored, once disclosure happens, their surplus should increase because they're just not going to look at the bad stuff. And this intuition is really mostly based on this idea that the supply of content is fixed and the type of content that's being produced is not going to change in response to the regulation. And there's this alternative perspective that's been presented for quite a while now about biased intermediaries, with most recently, applications directly to social media, which basically talks about how distorting, if you have this indirectly compensated intermediaries, distorting these compensation channels can be either good or bad for welfare and equilibrium. And the reason, what they're talking about is that the supply of content, the supply of sponsored and non-sponsored content is also going to change. And so what are we going to do in this paper? In this paper, we're going to focus, so we're going to tackle this question, and we're going to think about both kind of the supply of the type of content that's being produced in these markets before and after regulation, and also the engagement with users. And what we're really going to focus on is a novel feature of many of these online markets, which is basically like imperfect compliance, where basically we have these influencers who are resisting disclosure regulations, and many sponsored posts in our setting are not going to be disclosed, even after disclosure regulations are implemented. And if you think about it, this is also the case with Google, who may disclose the fact that they're getting paid from advertisers for posting the ad things at the top of your search results, but is not going to disclose that it owns YouTube necessarily, or owns other properties that are that they're linking to. And so we're going to do this in two ways. So there's two parts of the paper that should hopefully be available very soon for circulation. Basically, we're going to start with a simple theory model, which is going to kind of set our ideas and make us make sense of the empirical results later on. And in the theory model, we're basically going to have the interaction between an influencer and a bunch of followers, where the influencers are choosing between organic and sponsored posts. And then the idea is that the regulations are going to disclose a proportion of sponsored content, and that's going to have an ambiguous effect on both the amount of sponsorship in this market and overall welfare in this market. And then what we're going to do with this, so then we're going to take kind of the predictions from this model, and we're going to try to use data on Instagram influences in Germany and Spain to look at what happens when actual disclosure regulations hit. And so we're going to take advantage of the fact that Germany had these disclosure regulations that were actually like fairly binding in late 2016, that comes right in the middle of our sample. And so we're going to use something like difference and difference identification strategy. We're going to look at influencers in Germany and Spain, where Spain has no regulation, before and after German regulations come in. And then, of course, the big empirical problem here is that we don't actually directly observe whether a post is sponsored or not. And so what we're going to do is basically take advantage of natural language processing to detect and recover post-level sponsorship. And so then what we're going to be able to do is look at the effects of regulations on disclosure, on actual sponsorship, on the content of the post, and on the unfollower engagement.
Dan, a quick clarification.
Yeah,
do you think of this as, because you mentioned novel feature here in your first bullet, right? Do you think of this like a more of a short-run equilibrium effect, where over the long run, consumers are going to figure out what's sponsored and what's truly not? Like, I'll figure out that YouTube belongs to Google after a year or so, right? So then the harm of that dissipates over time. Should we think of it like that, or should we think of this as this is harmful period, right? Not long run or short run, but just harmful.
Yeah, so we think that some of this, so we're going to think about consumers as being fundamentally unsure of exactly what's sponsored and what's non-sponsored, and they're going to try to make inference about that based on the words that are used. I mean, of course, the YouTube example, it's a bit more obvious in the sense that you can figure out kind of that YouTube is owned by Google, but maybe, you know, there's some other ways, there are some other companies that you might not realize are owned by Google that are also making Google money. And so we're going to think about it as more of a longer run effect.
Yeah, like to give you another example, right? Like infomercials, like in the 90s, were super harmful is what was considered like in the first 2 years. But over time, people figured out, oh, this is just an ad. I understand that an infomercial is really an ad, and you don't have to disclose this to me. But there was a lot of like FTC attention upfront on these infomercials.
No, I think that's actually exactly right, in the sense that when you actually think about advertising on TV and stuff like that, right? Like they had to tell you, we'll return after these messages, right? After these commercials, in the sense that they have to like very explicitly disclose the fact that the advertised content is not the same as the authentic content, quote unquote, in this scenario. And so in our case, that's not necessarily going to be the case, right? Where we see stuff on Instagram or we see stuff on Twitter, you know, you can't directly tell whether or not whether it's sponsored or not. Great, that's it. And so let me just give you, a preview of what we're finding. Basically, what we're going to find in this data is a lot of undisclosed sponsored content. So this is sponsored content that looks like the disclosed sponsored content, but is actually not disclosed. And then the other piece that we're going to find is that disclosure regulations in Germany seem to actually increase disclosure. So in some sense, there was even questions in popular media and other places about whether these disclosure regulations and these very kind of flimsy online markets are going to work. So they seem to have worked in Germany. But then what we find is that there's still a substantial number of undisclosed sponsored posts even after disclosure regulations. And then we find basically a fairly substantial increase in sponsorship. So the share of sponsored content is increasing by about 3 percentage points, or by about at least 10%. And we find that this is actually the same among both disclosed and this is also the case for non-disclosed posts. So it's not just that disclosed sponsored content is increasing, which in some sense is not going to be bad. It's going to be exactly like the infomercial example. It's also that the undisclosed sponsored content is increasing after regulations in Germany. And then what we also find is that the average number of likes and comments is falling after regulations are introduced, which suggests that there are these kind of effects on the consumers. And so let me just give you a very quick, maybe too quick summary of the related literature. Basically, there's a few recent papers on the market for influence, and there's a few other ones that I'm not citing here, but essentially, our contribution here is really the empirical analysis on disclosure regulations in this market, as well as from a more theoretical or modeling perspective, the focus on undisclosed sponsored content as being important to the welfare effects. Then there's kind of the broader literature on disclosure regulations and intermediary advice quality. So there's a bunch of these papers, mostly from financial markets. And here, I think what's really interesting in this model is the fact that the intermediaries are resisting to or not complying to regulations. And this is not something you see, for example, in financial regulation markets, right? Like where people are in financial markets where, financial advisors are not refusing to disclose their affiliation or something like that. And then we also, I think, and the last piece that I want to highlight is that I think we do really cool things with Texas data. We use these multilingual embeddings, and we have a really novel interpretation of some of our supervised machine learning results. But let me just give you a quick outline, and then I'll pause for questions after. So next I'll tell you a little bit about the background of this market. Then I'll give you our a very quick overview of our theory model. Then I'll talk about the data methodology and the results. So let me just pause. I'll pause after the theory section, perhaps, once we've kind of set our ideas. And then I'll also pause after our data and methodology section, when I hope you'll actually figure out what we're doing in this paper empirically. Okay. So, yeah. So we're looking at, so just to give you one slide of background, we're looking at Instagram. And we're looking at sponsored content on Instagram, and sponsored content on Instagram is pretty prevalent, as it is on many social media websites. Before we started, I was just talking about how I keep getting sponsored ads from the Sputnik 5 vaccine, telling me about how great it is, probably because of my location in Europe. But basically the idea is that there's lots of these different kind of marketing agencies or intermediaries that are connecting the brands, so these are the advertisers, to influencers of various sizes. So there's a bunch of these websites, you can go on them and you can kind of check and see how much your influence as on Twitter or on Instagram matters to brands. And so what happens is that once you get connected to a brand as an influencer, you get into some sort of a contract. So mostly those contracts are per post. And so you get some sort of an amount of money per post that depends on your popularity. So, if you have a fairly small number of followers, you can get $50 per post. If you get, if you're like Kylie Jenner, you can get millions of dollars per post. Okay. And the interesting thing to specify is that the contracts usually actually specify the caption text. And we have some nice examples of this in the data, where you see these brands like Nike actually telling influencers what to say in the captions. Okay. And so this is how we think this sponsored market, the sponsorship market works. And then the question is about regulation. So basically, sponsored content is regulated in Europe in a very sort of patchwork way. So there's no uniform regulations, and they're not fully subject to the GDPR or any of those other existing rules. And one of the issues with regulating sponsored content is that there's a lot of ambiguity about what sponsored content is and about how commercial influencers are, because what you really want to do is regulate the commercial content rather than regulate everyone. And so what we're going to do is look at Germany, where there's fairly strict labeling requirements since late 2016. And there's even been a few fines and a number of high-profile legal cases since mid-2017. Okay, but there's still substantial. But I think I should actually probably highlight this. There's still some ambiguity about exactly like what constitutes an ad and what constitutes an ad by an influencer. Whether an influencer has to, if you're a travel influencer and you do some traveling for yourself and some traveling for a brand, you always have to. Some courts in Germany said that some of these influencers always have to disclose, but then that was overturned by a higher court. So again, there's still some ambiguity about exactly what needs to be disclosed and what doesn't need to be disclosed. But I should mention again, it's the stuff that the regulations in Germany are substantially more strict and are substantially more legally binding than the regulations that we see in other places like France, Italy, or the US. There's mostly a series of non-binding recommendations and public letters to influencers or brands, but no fines or cases. Okay. So that's the market. So now let me tell you a little bit about the model and just give you like a very quick sketch of what the model looks like, because I think it's going to be helpful both to understand what we're doing and it actually like helps guide some of our empirical strategy. And so in our model, we have a single influencer, and this influencer is interacting with a large number of followers. And what the influencers are doing in our model is basically choosing the proportion of between two types of posts. We're going to call them A and B. You can think about them as organic and sponsored posts, where each one of those posts of types is characterized by some sort of a distribution of words. Okay, so there's some words that are more proportionally represented in A posts and some words that are more proportionally represented in B posts. The influencers are choosing the type of posts, not the specific words. And again, this is consistent with kind of how contracts in this market work, when Nike tells you what to say. So if you choose a particular branded post, you don't have free choice over the words in this post. And so how do these influencers make money? They make money based on the engagement that they get. But then, if you think about two posts of the same type of engagement, B posts actually give influencers higher payoffs. Okay? Higher payoffs by this lambda. That's drawn from some distribution. But then the trick here is that followers are preferring to engage with the A post, with the organic post, rather than the B post that give influencers higher payoffs. But then, as I mentioned earlier, the followers without regulation don't actually know which post is which. But they do form beliefs about what is A and what is B based on observed words, and then choose to engage with the different types of posts at some cost. Okay. And then engagement that we're getting in equilibrium is an increasing function of the likelihood of a post being type A, of their organic post. And then given this endogenous engagement choice by the follower, the influencers are choosing the cutoff lambda, cutoff lambda, and then they're basically choosing, so they're choosing some sort of a cutoff for B posts, where they're choosing a proportion of B posts and A posts. Okay. And so then, what does regulation do in this market? In this market, basically, the first way that we're going to think about regulation is basically that it's just going to mark a fraction of all B posts with an extra expression that's never used in A posts. And this is going to tell a follower exactly what is a B post and what is an A post. Okay. And the interesting thing is that this is still going to have an equilibrium, an ambiguous equilibrium effect on the cutoff strategy of the influencers or on the share of B posts. And the reason why that's going to happen is that if you have a disclosed B post, followers are going to know that it's disclosed, so they're going to give it minimum engagement. But then you're going to have some B posts that are undisclosed. They're going to slip through the disclosure filter. And so when the B posts slip through the disclosure filter, their engagement can actually increase relative to the A posts, because the consumers are going to trust them relatively more. And so, so we have, like in the paper, a nice 2-word example. We have one word that's love, that's non-sponsored, and a word that's sale, that's sponsored. And in this case, in the 2-word case, we actually do get like an effect that the engagement for undisclosed posts unambiguously increases after regulation. And in some ways, this actually can happen in a different situation. We have, you might imagine that this sort of random fraction of all B posts being marked with an extra expression is unrealistic. So we also have another regulation that's word specific. So we imagine a scenario where there's 3 words: love, sale, and trick. Sale and trick are B words, so they're more likely in B posts. Love is more likely in A posts. And we're going to think about sale as being regulated, but trick is not regulated. So trick is a B word that's not going to be regulated in this market. And then what's going to happen when sale gets regulated, the returns to posting B posts could increase, and you're still going to trust more the undisclosed B posts, and so you're going to have more both disclosed and undisclosed B posts in equilibrium. Okay. And so in any case, the key point here is that undisclosed sponsored content is a really important channel for understanding the welfare effects of disclosure regulation, because it's really through these undisclosed B posts that everything is going to operate. And so then, and I think this really kind of, this idea of having different word distribution across different post type is really gonna help out understand what we're doing with our empirical approach. Because how do we think about spotting sponsored content in this market? We're basically, if regulation was not word specific, then we could just look for words that occur frequently in disclosed posts, or have some sort of like a list of words. And that's one thing we would do. But then, imagine that regulation is word specific. And so there's some sponsored posts that are not necessarily being regulated. So then suppose we're in the 3-word example, there's love, sale, and trick. And then there's 2-word posts. So there's love, sale, 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 trick, trick, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So trick, trick is never going to be regulated. But then, so then the question is whether we can actually understand that this is a sponsored post. And the answer is yes. And the way that we're going to do it is basically we're going to look for whether trick is more proportionally, is more like, so we're going to do this in 2 ways. Sorry, so we're going to do this in 2 ways. One way we're going to do this is thinking about the meaning of the word. And we're going to do this using embeddings. So we're going to think about whether trick is more like sale or whether trick is more like love in language usage. And if trick is more like sale than like love, then we're going to be able to uncover the trick is closer to a sale and is sponsored. And the other way is that we're just going to think about correlated usage and disclosed posts. So then if sale and trick are seen together relatively frequently, then we're actually going to be able to understand that trick is a word that connotes sponsoredness. And so we're going to be able to uncover that trick is going to be a sponsored post, even though it's never written. Okay, so this may have been a little confusing, but we'll talk about this again when I talk about our empirical strategy. So yeah, so let me just pause now and see whether there's questions before we get into the data and the empirics. There's 2 questions in the Q&A. I actually can't see it because I.
Yeah, we'll ask those.
Okay.
Yeah, then let me start with the Q&A questions. Then let me start with the second one, more about the context. So in the example, like you mentioned that this model says the company tells you what to say, like Nike tells me what to put in the post.
Mm-hmm.
There is question whether it goes against the trend now that influencers get more and more freedom regarding the sponsored content that they generate.
I mean, so I think that there is some freedom in terms of posting some stuff that of including some additional words potentially, but then still, like, if you actually look at some of these contracts, and there's a bunch of like legal papers that try to look at the actual contracts that influencers receive. If you're in a contract with Nike for posting 5 posts about their new shoes, you have to put in Nike or Nike.com in that, or buy this or something like that in those posts. Like you're not going to be able to get away with just including posts without some sort of specific words that talk about the product or talk about selling it. Okay.
I guess maybe before I go to the next question, maybe more generally about this, how should we think about this particular text that the sponsors will provide to the influencer change given the new regulation? Because the regulation can be based on the current, the consumers get signals from the text without the disclosure. And if I impose the regulation, now the text will also change in this different sale, trick, love examples. Is it part of that also?
So the actual distributions of words are not changing in this market, but the returns to undisclosed B posts. So the returns to B posts are going to increase, and they're going to specifically, the returns to trick posts are going to increase by a lot more because they're going to be undisclosed. But in some sense, in this framework, the influencers are not able to choose the specific words, right? So they're just picking the bin A or B, and then they're drawing stuff from the bin. They're drawing words from that bin. Now the question is, are the distributions changing over time? They could be changing over time, but then based on our methodology, if you're still going to see trick more proportionally posted together with sale, we're still going to be able to uncover that it's a sponsored post.
There is another follow-up question on the setup, whether sponsors require what kind of picture or pictorial elements to include.
Yeah, that's a good question. So we don't look at the pictures. I think they for sure. So I mean, again, like I think that even though Instagram is like a really visual medium, the captions actually seem to matter a lot in this market. And the reason is that you usually need something in the caption to be able to actually go to the website or to get information about the product. So we're not going to look at. So we may be missing some stuff that's happening in the pictures, but we're only looking at the caption.
Got it. More specifically on the toy example, what's an example of a sponsored post that uses the word trick?
Sorry, what? Can you repeat that?
I mean, when you chose, why did you choose the word trick here in this example? Like this question from Ken Wilbur, like whether with some examples of that, or just to explain the context.
Yeah, no, I mean, so the reason we're choosing trick is that it's a sponsored word that's never regulated. So in that sense, if you see it, it's harder it should be harder for you to think that it's sponsored relative to sale that is potentially regulated. So we're thinking about sale as like a very obvious sponsored word, and trick is kind of a slightly less obvious sponsored word. Although we can pick a slightly more subtle example.
Got it. And then one last question in the Q&A for now was about the more like results. Do you find it at the market level indicate that disclosure requirements increases the cost of advertising for the players?
So we don't actually have much on the advertiser side. So again, we do see disclosure increasing and we see advertising increasing. So again, it's not clear what's happening. Yes, I mean the advertising side is a piece that we're missing here, but we're kind of just seeing the equilibrium on the influencer side. Yeah.
Hi, Dan. I also had a kind of curious question here. What's different here, I guess, for me from regular advertising is that I wish this, Kim Kardashian is gonna actually recommend something that she uses. So there's a lot of wishful thinking, I imagine, on the follower side. And so if you don't disclose that this is an ad, I really hope that it's not. So that brings me to my question, like, how do you think about sort of a long-term strategy on the influencers side, to create a long-term relationship with these customers so they actually believe that this is, in a way, it brings them closer to these celebrities, so that they actually believe that this is something that they use.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the way we think about it, and we'll have a couple of examples of posts here. I mean, we think about this as people don't necessarily go to Kim Kardashian's website to buy products always. They more go they more check out her Twitter feed or her Instagram or TikTok feed to look at like pictures of her, pictures of her family, or whatever it is. And so there's still this kind of trade-off between organic and sponsored content that she's going to face over time. And if you actually look at, so it's kind of, so Matt's other paper actually has a bit more in this like dynamic relationship. So that we were looking at this as like a one-shot static game. In Matt's paper, you know, it's a dynamic relationship between an influencer and a follower. And so there's kind of this equilibrium investment strategy by the influencer and posting a bunch of quote unquote good content, followed by, you know, selling the attention that they're getting for the good content. And what the disclosure regulations in that setting do is they basically just shift everything down because they reduce the returns for posting sponsored stuff. Because in some sense, there's always going to be some people who are going to dislike, you know, sponsored content. And so that's kind of what that's gonna do. So I'm not sure if that was a fully realized answer, but yeah.
I got it. Thanks.
Thanks.
Then there is a couple more questions in the Q&A. So one is about text analysis. Let's maybe save it for later when we see the result data. Yeah. And then one quickly about a liability of sponsors, like whether Nike is liable for influencers non-disclosure.
Yeah, that's a really great question. And so that's not always the case. So there's actually a bunch of, so there's ways of getting around this issue of liability where, you know, Nike is actually contracting these marketing agencies, these intermediaries. And so in principle, these intermediaries are liable for disclosure or non-disclosure. But then, you know, again, I have anecdotal evidence basically suggests that these intermediaries are saying that because the influencer is not directly contracted with Nike, they don't have to disclose, even though that's not necessarily the case. So yeah, so there's ambiguity about exactly who is liable, whether the brand or the marketing agency is liable for disclosure or non-disclosure. I think it depends on the specific contract structure. Yeah.
Got it. Thanks. One last question from me, if I can. How does the supply of the sponsored content work in this market? Is there like infinite supply and the influencer can pick as many as they want, or there is very limited supply?
Yeah, so I mean, the way that we think about it is basically that there's infinite supply. I mean, we're going to look at influencers who are basically like popular enough, so you know they have like tens of thousands of followers. And so for those types of influencers, you can basically, I mean, I think there's a lot of different contractual arrangements for brands that they can choose between. Yeah. Okay.
Got it. Thanks.
Awesome. So so let me just continue, and then I'll talk a little bit about the data and our empirical approach, and then I'll take a few questions about the data. Okay. So how do we tackle this empirically? So the way that we're going to do this empirically is basically we're going to take we're going to look at data from Spain and Germany, and we're going to basically get a random sample of 6,000 German and 6,000 Spanish influencers. So this is going to start with the raw data. We're getting the names of these influencers from this influencer marketing agency called Hype Auditor. And basically the restriction was that they were all pretty popular. So they all have more than 10,000 followers by May 2019. And they're actually all local in the, so basically this marketing agency can tell where the follower has some proprietary algorithms to figure out where the followers of each influencers are coming from. So what they told us is that all these influencers are local. So the German influencers are mostly popular in Germany and the Spanish influencers are popular in Spain. And this is actually very important for our empirical analysis so that they're not affected by, you know, other regulations that are happening around this time. So then we know that they're local, we know they're popular, and then we also have like a topic for each influencer, which is basically like, let's think about their market. So whether or not they're, you know, mom influencers, modeling influencers, dog influencers, etc. And then for each one of these influencers, we collected their full history of posts using CrowdTangle, which is basically a tool owned by Facebook to look at Instagram data. And then, so for each influencer and post, we observe the text of the post, the date of the post, the number of likes in the post, the number, but not the text of the comments of the post, and some other characteristics about the post. And then we also have some data on the followers at the time of each post, but there's a lot of missing values in this data. So the raw data is really at this like influencer post level with this sample of influencers. And so then just to give you like a preview of what we're going to do in this paper, so the first thing we need to do is figure out what's sponsored, what's not sponsored. So we need to measure sponsorship in this market. And basically to do this, we're going to use the text of posts and some classification algorithms. And then we need to do some causal inference to try to figure out the causal effects of regulation on outcomes like sponsorship or engagement. And so here we're going to just use difference and differences, but we're going to combine this with a matching strategy, course and exact matching, to make sure that we're looking at a sample of comparable influencers, like within the same market and also with the similar characteristics. And so let's just get into the methodology. Basically, if you think about just looking at disclosure, that's very easy because we know exactly what sponsored and disclosed posts look like because we know that they're labeled with some words. So we have a set of words, hashtag ad, hashtag verbung, or hashtag other things that denote disclosure of sponsorship. And then we can just look at their incidence in Germany relative to Spain over time in the raw data. And so when you look at that, and so the red line here is Germany, the blue line here is Spain, and this looks at the proportion of sponsored posts, of disclosed posts, as of the total number of posts posted by the influencers in that month. And basically what you see, so the first dashed line here are the introductions of regulations in Germany. The second dashed line is the date that the first fines went to influencers. And basically, again, we're gonna do, we're gonna look at like pre-trans and do all this other stuff. But basically, like if you just eyeball these two lines, the red line for Germany and the blue lines for Spain, you see that the disclosure increases in Germany substantially after regulations are introduced. Okay, so this is just something that you can see directly in the raw data by looking at specific words that denote disclosure. But then that's not necessarily the same as words that are denoting sponsorship. And there's a lot of ambiguity here in terms of what is actually a sponsored post and what is a non-sponsored post. So we're very attached to these like Kylie Jenner, these 4 Kylie Jenner posts that we think are good examples of the different types of posts that are various levels of disclosure and sponsorship, where the post at the top left-hand side is basically an ad for some sort of a tea, and it's very clearly disclosed with a hashtag ad, and it basically gives you like a code or a coupon for 25% for this particular like tummy tea or whatever. Then the post at the bottom left-hand side is an ad for Adidas, and it's also more or less disclosed. It says that she's an Adidas ambassador. It has a direct like link to the shop, et cetera, et cetera. The post at the top right-hand corner is not sponsored and not disclosed as sponsored. It basically like has very little text and just a picture of her. And then the post at the bottom right-hand corner is probably the most interesting one. So it's a post of like her home, basically that was decorated by some interior decorator guy. And the interesting thing is that it's not clear exactly what the contractual relationship is between Kylie Jenner and this interior decorator. I mean, it's very easy to imagine a situation where she got free decoration and returns to posting this particular post with a link to this person's website. Okay, and so there's this inherent ambiguity in terms of figuring out what is a sponsored post and what is a non-sponsored post, just based on the words. And so we're going to take a couple of approaches to figuring out what sponsored and undisclosed sponsored posts look like. And I mean, so again, even after disclosure in Germany, we're still worried about the presence of these sponsored and undisclosed posts because they're likely present in the sample period in both countries. Basically, like, one thing that we did is have an MTurk survey for a sample of our posts in Germany after regulation. And basically respondents label about 50% of undisclosed posts in Germany as sponsored. Okay, so there seems to be a substantial amount or number of these sponsored posts in Germany, even after disclosure regulation, undisclosed posts in Germany. And so we're going to have 2 ways of uncovering these sponsored posts. The first way is just going to have manual keyword-based approach. So we're just going to have a bunch of keywords that we think connote commercial intent or sponsorship. So stuff like discount, code, links to websites, links to a bunch of brand references, stuff that's saying buy this. Okay, so we're gonna have a bunch of those. The drawback here is that we're gonna have to pick the keywords ourselves. So we want to kind of avoid doing that and avoiding the input that we have as researchers. And so we also have this supervised machine learning approach. And in the supervised machine learning approach, we're going to use training data from Germany after regulation settles down. And we're essentially, what we're going to do is we're going to convert the text of all the posts into multilingual embedding space using Facebook's fast text. And what it does is that it puts, instead of word space where we're looking at posts composed of different words, we're going to convert all the posts into 300 size vectors, continuous vectors of meaning. And so the idea is that, and it's actually also going to be multilingual, so it's going to solve the problem of translation because we're going to have Spanish posts and German posts to be in the same 300 vector continuous space, embedding space. And then what we're going to do is we're going to use a bunch of these supervised classifiers to look for meaning that predict disclosure and non-disclosure posts. And the idea is that we're going to look at, we know that posts in Germany after disclosure that are disclosed are actually sponsored. And so we're going to look for meanings, so for areas of the embedding space that are associated with these disclosed and sponsored posts. And then we're going to say that the posts that are similar in meaning to those disclosed and sponsored posts are also going to be sponsored. And then we're going to project this trained algorithm on all remaining German and Spanish posts. And again, I just want to highlight the fact that we don't necessarily, so we're going to, actually, maybe I say this in the next line. Yeah, okay, so let me just tell you what we do. So basically, so then what we find is that both the manual and machine learning classifiers basically going to successfully pick up about 70 to 80% of disclosed posts. So again, for machine learning methods, basically the recall score and the training data with 5-fold cross-validation is pretty good. But then our classifiers are also going to pick up a lot of false positives. And in most applications, this is actually bad news. But in this application, this is good because it means that our classifiers are picking up sponsorship rather than disclosure. And basically, what we also find is that the false positives are correlated with MTurk classified undisclosed sponsored posts. So they seem to be actually picking up. So what we're picking up in this using our classifiers is sponsorship rather than disclosure. Okay. So as I mentioned in this like trick sale example, we're actually picking up those trick words as sponsored. On average, the classifiers agree with each other, but they're far from unanimous. And then we're essentially just going to throw all of them at our analysis, including combinations of the classifier and the man.
And just a clarification
yeah,
on the data.
Of course.
You don't have situations where the same ad, say in Germany, is visible before the regulation, but without hashtag ad, and after regulation with hashtag ad. Is that not possible? Because that would kind of obviate your need to do these kinds of machine learning approach. I mean, you would have a cleaner experiment in some sense. Maybe that's not there in the data. It's not a panel on ads.
I mean, I'm not sure. I think we could look for similar words for similar ads before and after, but in some sense, that's not necessarily going to tell us if there's stuff that's non-disclosed and sponsored in the post period.
Right, but you can almost imagine like the situation where before the regulation hits, this was like an sponsored but undisclosed, and now the same ad exists. I guess this is not like TV ads where the same ads are being aired, right? These are every day a new text comes in. That's why the challenge.
Yeah, so there's a lot of new text that's happening in this market over time, and we have a period of about 6 years of our data. So this is a substantial period of time. Yeah, so it's not going to be like we're not going to necessarily. So we can check if there's the same if there's the same text of ads before and after, but I don't think that's particularly likely.
I guess like in your example of the T, I guess before this regulation would not have appeared as an undisclosed ad, and after regulation there's hashtag ad. I guess that would be like a clean before after check on this, right?
Yeah, like whether we actually like pick up sponsorship with our classifiers, or just to look at the effects of disclosure.
Not for picking up. So I guess I believe that the machine learning is doing as you said, 70 to 80% is picking up that, but just in terms of understanding the effect of disclosure on like followers and what other characteristics they're interested in.
Yeah, I see what you're saying. Yeah, so I think for the engagement stuff, I think we could try to look for like a cleaner experiment in the data, but then part of what we're looking for is also the supply side effect, and for that we really need the machine learning or some sort of like a classifier to pick up the stuff.
Got it.
Okay, great. So yeah, so let me just give you like a quick, a very quick overview of our empirical approach, and then I'll pause for questions again. So basically, like what we do is, again, this is like a kind of vanilla diff and diff. We have an outcome. We have a regulated dummy that's equal to 1 for German influencers after regulation. And we're going to control for a bunch of influencers and country varying controls like account age and country characteristics, including GDP, country population, and also country level Google Trends of Instagram search intensity to capture some sort of like demand shocks. And then we're also going to have influencer and time fixed effects. We're going to test for pre-trends to look for anticipation. And then the thing that we're really worried about is that even though we have this like large random sample of influencers, they're not necessarily comparable. And I don't think this marketing agency really care that much about giving us comparable influencers. And so basically what we're going to do is we're going to use a matching procedure to restrict our estimating sample to match influencers. We're going to match exactly on topic and account age. So we're going to look for influencers, on a similar topic and similar account age, and then pre-treatment characteristics like mean likes, mean number of comments, and the mean number of posts per month coarsely. And so that's going to kind of generate a very comparable sample. And then we're going to run the different diff on that match sample. So let me stop here before I get into our results, and I'll take some more questions. I think we're almost out of time, right? How's the timing?
Yeah. So yeah, there was a couple of questions in the Q&A. Let me just bring those up quickly. One is there was a question about a pre-trend. So there seemed to be a different trend before the treatment for Germany and other countries. What could explain that?
So I mean, it's not clear. Maybe in Germany there might have been discussion about regulation before regulations were actually implemented. So the solid line is actually looking at the implementation date, but there's probably some discussion about that beforehand. So that might explain some of this. But we do test formally for pre-trends, and it doesn't seem to be a particular concern statistically. Okay.
There was a question about retroactive disclosure, that influences add disclosures to older posts after discussions or disclosure become popular.
Yeah, so I mean, I don't think that you can get, I don't think you can be legally liable for not disclosing something before disclosure regulations come in, for posting a non-disclosed post before regulations come in. And moreover, I mean, these influencers are posting a lot. So they're posting, 40 posts per month. So it's not likely that they're going to go back to all their posts to disclose them. And then in some sense, we should be able to see, that should reduce all of our effects, because there should see more disclosure happening in the pre-period relative to less.
Is there any sponsors that are large enough to control a significant fraction of the sponsored posts? And if so, do they matter in the model and in this context?
So I think, so we have a fairly large sample of influencers, and it doesn't, I mean, when we look for like brand names or something like that, it doesn't seem like there's a substantial amount of any type of brand, at least. So that's not, so that's my answer.
Got it. Actually, slightly related to this and to maybe quickly on follow up on this, slightly related to this and to Anita's question earlier on. Do you see the same sponsored post done, kind of posted by different influencers, but in one case the influencer puts an ad and doesn't?
Yeah, so we haven't checked for that, to be honest, but that's something we should totally look for, because I think that would probably help us a bit. Yeah, that's something we can check for.
And I was just going to say, maybe we should just get to the results, because we're close to running out of time. So
okay, yeah. Okay, awesome. Results. Okay, so let me just show you something that's a bit closer to the data. So these are just differences in predicted sponsored post shares between Germany and Spain. So each line here. So this is a bit of a confusing graph to explain, but basically, like, each line is a difference between the average, the average share of sponsored posts, of predicted sponsored posts in Germany minus the predicted sponsored post in Spain in that month. And then the red line is like an average of all of those lines. So for a given month, we average all of the differences between these different classifiers. And this is basically what we would have shown the red line. And then in the other lines are just individual classifiers effects. So these are not standard errors, by the way. But basically, like the punchline here is that the left-hand stuff is lower than the right-hand stuff, is lower than the right-hand difference. And so it seems like there's an increase in sponsored content in Germany after disclosure regulations come in. And this is also true in the absolute. So we do see an absolute increase in sponsored content in Germany, not just a relative effect. And we do see similar pictures when we only look at undisclosed posts as well. So there's an increase in sponsored and undisclosed posts. And so then that's not a regression. So let me just show you some regression results. And so basically, so the outcomes, so in every one of these regressions, the outcome is the predicted influencer month share of sponsored post share. So this is the percentage of posts that they're posting that are predicted to be sponsored according to different algorithms. So the first line is, so the first column is naive Bayes, the second one is stochastic gradient descent, the third one is basically predicted by a decision tree algorithm, and the fourth one is a random forest algorithm. And then at the bottom, we have a combination between each machine learning algorithm and our manual approach. So we're only labeling something as sponsored if it was labeled by a machine learning algorithm and our manual approach. And basically what we find is that across the board, we see increases in Germany after the regulation period, controlling for influencer and time fixed effects, and a bunch of country controls and other influencer level controls. And so relative to kind of the a pre-regulation mean of about 30% sponsorships, is 30% of those posts that they're posting are sponsored before regulation. There's an increase of about 3% or 3.4% according to the naive Bayes, so about a 3 percentage points or a 10% increase in sponsored rates with the naive Bayes algorithms. According to some other ones, there's even bigger increases, but essentially this is where we get this like 3 percentage point increase number from. And we see that consistently across all of our different classifiers. There's an increase in sponsorship in Germany. And again, we don't just see this overall. We also see that there's an increase in the sponsored shares conditional on non-disclosure. So only by looking at non-disclosed posts, we also see an increase in sponsorship rates in Germany. And again, the magnitude is a little bit smaller here because a lot of the sponsored content becomes disclosed in Germany, but we're still kind of finding these increases in sponsorship in this market. Okay, and then we do a few other things. So we also look at this disclosure, and again we find that we see a big increase in disclosure as we saw in the figure a few slides ago. We also do the same thing for our just using our manual sponsored labeling procedure, and we also find an increase in sponsorship. And then importantly, we also look at the number of posts to see whether influencers are posting more or less. And there doesn't seem to be a statistically significant change in the number of posts that they're posting, which suggests that this is really happening as our model is talking about, kind of at the share range rather than at the extensive margin in terms of how many posts they're actually posting. And then the last thing I wanted to show you was the stuff about engagement, right? So we also care about how followers are responding to these regulations. And so here our outcomes are basically all of these sort of engagement level outcomes. So this is the average. So the first column is the average number of likes that an influencer's posts get in a month. The second is the average number of comments that an influencer posts get in a month. And the third is an influencer's average number of followers in a month. And I should just mention that for the last column, we have again, our data is very incomplete. So we only have, we have a much smaller sample here. But basically what we find is that for all of those that they seem to be going down in Germany after regulation. So together with the increase in sponsorship, there's a decrease in engagement that's happening both at the like level, at the comment level, and a little bit more weakly in a statistical sense at the follower level. Okay, and these are all substantial decreases. Now we do have a bunch of robustness checks. So we do timing tests to look for pre-trends, which someone mentioned, and then we find no systematic statistically significant differences in main outcomes prior to regulation. We look at post-level sponsorship probabilities. Again, so some of our classifiers actually generate a post-level probability that a post is sponsored. And we find that the probability distribution shifts in Germany after regulation. And then the third thing that I wanted to highlight in the last couple of minutes that I think is one of the coolest things that we can do is basically stop relying on our classifiers and basically just look at the embeddings directly. And so we have a post-level meaning. And for each post-level meaning, we can calculate the distance in meaning space of a post from a vector of zeros. And then we can look at how the meanings, the average meanings of posts change in Germany relative to Spain after regulation. And what we can show is that embeddings in Germany move on average relative to embeddings in Spain, exactly in the way that you, and this is happening again, both for disclosed and non-disclosed posts, suggesting that this is really an effect that's coming from the underlying meaning of words rather than something to do with our classifiers. And then, of course, we do everything with our non-matched sample, with our bigger sample of 12,000 influences, and everything kind of seems to hold. And so in the last couple of minutes, let me just conclude and maybe highlight some of the next steps that we want to take, because I think this is kind of the first paper of what we hope is at least a 2-paper project. So in this paper, we use a new data set of influencer activity to look at the effects of advertising disclosure regulation. And theory basically suggests that disclosure regulations can increase advertising on platforms and specifically operate through this undisclosed sponsored post. And we find evidence consistent with these effects. We find an increase in sponsorship and an increase in non-disclosed sponsorship. And we also find evidence suggesting of changing engagement, which also suggests a reduction in welfare somewhat. Although, you know, if you really want to think about welfare, you really need a model. And so we have a few kind of these like longer term big picture goals that really require an underlying model. And I think our little toy theory model helps us, is kind of the first step towards building a kind of a bigger, a real structural model that allows us to do some counterfactuals. And specifically, we can with a model, you can actually do some counterfactual regulation schemes and see how influencers react to different proposed regulations. You can also start thinking about welfare more directly, rather than just these like suggestive evidence about engagement. And then the last thing that I think is really cool that we can potentially do is try to bring together our natural language processing and our economic incentives. Because our theory directly predicts what is going to happen to the distribution of posts, to the types of posts that influencers choose. And we can use those predictions to start to actually label posts. Because right now what we're doing is we're doing everything kind of separately, even in different programs, but we can start kind of thinking about NLP and economic incentives together, because I think this is really what's happening in this market. And so I think I'm right about out of time. So let me just stop here and thank you for all the questions and comments and for inviting me to the seminar. It's been really great. Thanks.
That's great. Thank you, Dan. So with this, we'll finish the kind of formal part of the talk. We can do the questions in the way of a kind of open discussions now. So if you have any question or want to join the discussion, please raise your hand or flag to us. We'll just join you to the panel.
I had a quick question, Dan. I was wondering, did you look at the content of the ads after disclosure? Like, they seem to offer more promotions or something like that to help with the decrease in engagement, or what do the successful ads look like after the change?
So we looked at content a little bit. There's some stuff about like so we looked at whether there's more kind of direct sale stuff, like buy this and get a 20% discount, and there does seem to be more of this. And we also looked at so one of the things we thought about a little bit is again like thinking about welfare, and basically like if we have like a market like health, whether there's more advertising of like diet supplements or some stuff that you think is like directly like bad for consumers. And we do have some suggestive evidence that some of this stuff is changing, but it's nothing like too tight yet.
Just kind of following from that,
Mm-hmm.
I think you all just used like category fixed effects to avoid some of these questions, but I imagine there's fairly strong category effects where we're more versus less, whatever, accepting of disclosure. So I was wondering where that kind of falls into your framework or thought process within everything.
Yeah. So in principle, like, so we have influencer fixed effects in the regressions. And then I think the meaning space kind of helps soften this a little bit, because we're not looking at like specific words that people use, but rather like the average like space of meaning. So we think that, on average, that ads may look a little bit similar across different categories. But yeah, there are definitely like heterogeneity in terms of different topics. And there was a lot of stuff going on, so it was a bit hard for us to kind of come up with anything super conclusive out of this. But it does exist, yeah, and we might look at it some more. But that's a really good question.
Related to that, I guess I'm imagining, and maybe this is just so I'm understanding if this is what you're getting at, Jared, that there's some things where maybe there is no sponsorship aversion. And so then you wouldn't see this. So for example, exactly. I don't know, I follow a skier on Instagram, and he's sponsored by a bunch of companies that make ski gear. This is kind of a concept that I'm very familiar with and comfortable with. If all of a sudden, the marketing professors that I started following are like hawking potato chips or whatever, then maybe this would be sort of weird. And I would finally realize that actually that's why Andre's been posting so much about his potato chips. So, I mean, I feel like that could be actually kind of interesting, because it would get at this consumer taste for disclosure or not or something.
Yeah, so we did look at this a little bit. So we looked at, let me try to remember what exactly it was, but I think it was like, we're trying to find like gym influencers or something like that, and how much they're hawking like I guess if you're following someone, that's actually the other example, where you're following them not specifically for like whey powder or whatever, but you're following to like for an exercise routine. But we did try to look at that, but it's a bit hard to find like a clean market for that, or a clean set of comparison influencers. But yeah, that's a good point.
Dan, cool study and cool data. Thank you. My quick questions are more on the methods. I noticed that you used the course CEM, course in exact matching, and not PSM or Mahalanobis distance method or any of the fine stratification. Any reason why?
So I like the non-parametric approach of the CEM rather than like the logit parametrization of the propensity score matching or something like that. Although we did also do it with propensity score matching, and it looks very similar. So I don't think that the the specific matching strategy really matters as much here.
Yeah, because for CEM, I think it does give you a better covariate balance, but for confounding effects and then more precision of effects, did you compare that? Because you have this you have a problem of one country implementing this, and then you have control units issue. So maybe there is some merit to looking at that. I looked at some of your results, and I noticed a lot of differences between even the ML methods that you use, like random forest. I could see a 50% effect. I don't know if you have the slides in front of you, but I'm just thinking, how sensitive are these to this? Because, you're trying to do a lot of, estimations in here. You're trying to infer the sponsored content. You're doing a lot of these things. So it may be worthwhile to examine how sensitive these results are to those different methods.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I mean, I think it's less sensitive to the specific matching method rather than the specific kind of prediction methods.
ML methods.
Because I think the prediction methods are really what's kind of shifting things around. And we did look at like how much the different prediction methods agree with each other, and they seem to I mean, they have pretty good like agreement rates and all this sort of stuff, but they're not perfect. But then we do think that they're potentially like picking up different areas of this meaning space as sponsored, because all of them do pretty well in some sense. So that's why we decided to kind of just throw all of them in there. But I agree that we should try more robustness, and there is a lot of kind of noise in the background here that's potentially affecting the results. So that's a very good point.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Dan, like a slightly question on this. So it kind of at the back of my mind, I was wondering why the regulator is like, why is not everything getting disclosed, right? So this like, and you mentioned this penalty period. I don't know if you showed us results before and after the penalty. I don't know if that I might have missed that, but that's kind of it kind of makes it, maybe it's more serious. And why is like, what information does a regulator have that say lay consumers like us don't, right? So it's kind of, do they see the contracts? Are they also kind of doing the sale versus trick kind of thing in their heads? What's going on, right, behind the regulators' incentives here?
Yeah. So how is the regulator actually thinking about these? So I mean, I think there was a lot of ambiguity about. I mean, I think the law was actually like pretty clear about commercial. Let me just go back here. About like commercial. So what the law said is that commercial regulators need to label everything that they're getting paid for. Yeah. Or compensated for. And so then the question is exactly like how your compensation works, right? Like if you're so they're in different courts in Germany in different local areas. We're facing different complaints, I guess, and we're making different judgments. So there was a lot of uncertainty between different courts as these things were slowly progressing about what exactly influence was needed to disclose. And there was actually like one court, and I think we mentioned this, we mentioned this in our paper that is hopefully going to come soon, and you'll be able to, I'll read it. But there was one court in Germany that actually said that every single post by any influencer that ever received payment for posting should be disclosed as an ad. Because if you've ever made money for sponsorship, you're a commercial influencer.
Right.
But then that was actually like overturned by a higher court later on. But again, there's like a lot of these different kind of interpretations about.
Are the fines coming directly from the regulator, or like, so I would imagine like in the US, right? The FTC does some of this work themselves, but they're also getting information from competitors, from consumers who are, filing complaints, and that's kind of where most of the information comes from.
Yeah.
Right. So if I'm Nike and I see like a Reebok ad which is not disclosed, I might actually go to the regulator and say, look, Reebok is doing this, right? So there's a bit of.
No, so the fines that we've seen are going directly on the to the influencers. So the influencers are fined, and then it is like so I mean, this is in Germany, the law is run by the competition authority. So it's the competition authority that's kind of fining these influencers.
Yeah, so I think also similar to Dean's comment on the category, right? I would imagine like a brand like Nike or the big brands would be more like risk averse, maybe, right? Like, I don't know, this is just a hypothesis versus like your contractors, like you showed in that example, might like, okay, let's try this, and they might not disclose this, or they might not suggest disclosure. So you might see a big brand or a popular brand versus not popular brand effect. But looks like most of the cases you're highlighting in this bullet point looks like they're high profile cases, so must be the big brands are actually doing this.
So they were big brands, and again, like I think the contractual structure where most influencers are not directly contracted by the brand. Like if you're Nike, you might have a contract with like Kylie Jenner, but you won't have a contract with like I don't know, an influencer with like 20,000 followers. Like that, those are mostly like subcontracted, I guess, to these different branding agencies.
Yeah, but like one potential is to see like whether these effects are different by like big brand versus small brand.
Yeah, no, that's a great. Thank you.
Then one quick thought on the previous discussion about the text and how it evolves. I wonder if you can use the same data and the imbalance to see if after the regulation in Germany, there is just different structure of all the posts which happen in the market, because the regulation will also change as a sponsor what kind of text I want to provide. And if I know that now the influencer can decide to disclose or not to disclose, I'll try to mimic this new structure of the post. And this is one of the ways to test whether the text and this design of this messages change over time and potentially rule it out.
Yeah. So I mean, yeah. So again, like I would hope our current methods are picking some of this up as sponsored, even if the actual text is changing, as long as the underlying distribution of, like, as long as they're drawing words from this like B distribution and the B words are correlated with each other, then we should be able to pick up that structure. But I agree that we can just take a look at the embeddings more directly and see exactly how they're, and try to look a little bit more at how they're changing. Maybe like the variance of the embeddings is changing or something like that. Although it's a bit, it was a bit tricky. Honestly, it was a bit tricky to do with like 300 these like R300 vectors. It wasn't obvious how to think about them moving.
Right. I think like the necessary condition here for this to worry about that is that with the regulation, my also design of the sponsored messages change. And because of that, if I want to hide as an undisclosed one, I'll also change that design. So maybe, that's, I feel like that's, we don't think about the design of the messages and like what is this is a choice for all these players. And I just descriptively seems like interesting, easy, like not easy, but like interesting thing to check.
No, that's great. Thanks. Yeah.
All right. So I think we're out of questions in the chat. So thanks everyone. Thanks a lot for joining. Thank you, Dan, for the talk, and thank you for all the panelists for joining with questions. This was great.
Thank you all. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, this is very
Thanks, everyone.
interesting. Thanks a
Bye.
lot.
Bye.
Thanks.